So whenever you're mixing, it's definitely quite easy to go a bit wild with the different effects plugins that you're using inside your track. There's so many incredible pieces of software these days that sometimes the unlimited flexibility that you're afforded inside of a digital audio workstation can become a hindrance to getting good mixes. So what can happen is you have really long effects chains, and you start to use plugins to fix problems that you created earlier on in your effects chain with other plugins. So for example, you use too much subtractive EQ on a single part, and then you go back later with another equalizer to try to boost that frequency that you removed. This is something that I used to do a lot in my mixes, and this is kind of my process of going through and simplifying my effects chains to make sure I'm not using too many plugins, and to make sure that the changes that I'm making inside my mixes are actually effective in helping my mix overall, and if they're not, I go through and remove those effects that aren't needed. So in this video, we'll be talking about strategies to simplify your effects chains. That way you don't have a bunch of effects kind of boosting and cutting the same frequencies at the same time. And we'll also talk a bit about choosing the right effect for the job. So the strategy of kind of testing multiple styles of compression, that'll be the example that we're using today, to see which compressor best fits the song that we're working on. This is something that mixing engineers talk about all the time, is trying out various different compressors to see which one fits sort of the vibe of the track that you're going for, but no one ever really shows you exactly how to do this, or how to identify the different characteristics of different types of compression. So that's what we'll be doing in this mixing video as well. So the first thing I want to do is take a look at a problematic effects chain that I've created for this song. So everything sounds like this with a little bit of mixing. And what I want to focus in on is going to be this acoustic guitar. So this guitar doesn't sound too bad in context of the track, but there's definitely some problems with the way that I went about mixing it. This is a pretty common mixing setup that I found myself in all the time whenever I was working on my mixes initially, whenever I was starting out. And then this is now how I go back and sort of simplify my mixing process. So let's take a look at what we have going on here. First, we have some simple equalization. We have everything being cut below 200 or 202. Then we have some of these high frequencies being cut out as well because I don't really need it for this track. So this looks good so far. Then we have a pretty simple compression, nothing too heavy. Just kind of leveling some of the peaks of that guitar. So far that looks good as well. And then we could take a look at this reverb, and this is what I want to draw your attention to. It's going to be this reverb, and also this equalizer as well. So we have a few different interesting things going on here. First, we have quite a bit of reverb. This mix is set to 30%. But the main problem here is I'm cutting out a lot of the bass from this reverb, which is something that you do actually want to do quite often on your sounds. But then because of my use of this high mix control, I'm actually blending a lot of the signal back into the original that doesn't have any bass on it. So basically this is almost high pass filtering this whole sound, and then I have to go through and boost these frequencies again. So basically whenever we're looking at our effects chain, I've kind of cut out too much bass frequencies and I'm using too much of this mix control. Basically this is what happens whenever I increase this. You can see that we kind of lose all those low mids. That's basically what this is doing, is it's actually acting as a high pass filter because of the way I went about cutting out these bass frequencies. And then I went back and added them in again, where it would have been a lot simpler just to have removed a little bit less of those bass frequencies. And then also went back to this first equalizer and cut everything maybe at about 120 or so. Then that reverb, we could adjust things to about 150, so that way there's no sub bass hanging out inside of our reverb signal. But then we have a lot of that bass that's come back into our signal, and we don't need to boost it all over again. Then taking a look at the high frequencies, we can see that we've boosted these again, but in the initial equalizer I actually low passed everything. So this isn't a very efficient use of equalization. Basically what we could do to simplify this, just remove that second equalizer, and if I need more high frequencies, go back to that first EQ, and make a high frequency adjustment to bring them back in, rather than cutting everything with the EQ and then trying to go back later and adding it back in. You'll get a much cleaner and much more professional sound if you're a bit more careful about how you go about equalizing things and you don't cut and boost the same types of frequencies. The other thing that we could see here as well is we have two compressors that are basically doing the same thing, This one is just kind of acting as a leveler and isn't really doing much at all. So we could also remove this as well. And if I needed more compression, I could just bring that threshold down. And then because of that sort of high pass effect that's happening because of our heavy use of the reverb, I could actually go ahead and just dial that back down to about 15%. And then everything sounds like this. So this guitar still has a nice bright and lively tone, but we don't have any of those low subby bass frequencies that are causing problems. We have a nice compression that's kind of helped leveling everything. And then this reverb gives us a nice spacey ambience, but without removing too much frequencies because of the way that we have everything set up. So context the track, it sounds like this. So the moral of the story here is to go back through your different signal chains in your mixes and ask yourself, is that effect that you've added in really necessary? And if it isn't a necessary effect, then go ahead and remove it. And also make sure to double check and make sure that you're not cutting and then boosting a frequency, because that'll remove a lot of the clarity that you have from the original recordings. So it'll get a much cleaner result if you're a bit more strategic about how you use your effects. And if you're finding that after an effect is used, you start to lose a lot of low frequencies or low mids, check and make sure that there's not any sort of heavy filtering going on inside of that effect that could be creating that problem for you. So then from there, let's talk about how to pick the right effect for the job. So we'll be looking at compressors as an example, and how to listen to various different types of compressors to see which one would work best for this mix that we're working on. Let's go ahead and hop on over to our drums. I could just solo those for now, which sound like this with no compression. And then let's try out a few different types of compressors and find out which one will complement the track the best. So what I have here is 3 different styles of compression. These are 3 different VST plugins. We have the built-in one from Ableton, which is a SSL modeled bus compressor, really excellent sounding compressor. And then we have the Waves Puigchild stereo bus compressor, which emulates a Fairchild 670 compressor, which is a vintage tube compressor. And then I also have a BSS DRP 402 compressor, which is a compressor that was initially designed for use in broadcasting applications, so especially on voiceovers and radio and things like that. But it's a very aggressive and very colorful sounding compressor that I really love. I actually have a hardware version of this. And each of these compressors has their own different sound. Let's go ahead and listen to each of them and identify the core characteristics that they each give to the sound, and then pick which one best works for this track. So this idea of having a quick compressor shootout or even a quick EQ shootout as well with similar settings enables you to pick the best effect for the job and the effect that best complements your mixdown. So rather than just layering in tons of different compressors to try to get the type of sound you're looking for, load up a few different compressors and try them out like this, because this will help you strategically use the best compressor or best effects device for the job, and the result will be a lot cleaner sounding mixdowns. And the settings on these compressors aren't 100% identical. I tried to set them as close as possible, but because of the differences between each of the different devices, they're going to be slightly different. But the first one sounds like this. So in this one, you hear really nice low end, especially from that kick drum, and it really brings up the volume of the elements that are happening in between the kicks and snares. Makes everything just sound very punchy and very fat. Especially that kick drum sounds quite nice. The next compressor, the Fairchild 670 compressor, is going to emulate a vintage tube compressor, the Fairchild 670. It's going to give us a very natural and open sounding compression. It also kind of has this nice crunchiness to it as well, because whenever the input is overdriven, it gives you a lot of saturation and distortion and harmonics because of the tubes that are inside the original unit that this is emulating. Listen to the difference in the way the kick drum is compressed on the Fairchild and on the SSL. This one's going to be a lot more open. And this one has more bass. Then from there we could take a look at a third compressor. This is going to be the BSS DRP 402 compressor. So this compressor is a lot more aggressive sounding. It's a lot quicker, even with similar release times to what the SSL is. And it's going to be a lot more kind of this hard rock aggressive tone. So this is actually a very interesting sounding compressor, and it's also really excellent on vocals. So let's compare all three of those different compressors and listen to how the kicks and snares change in tone, even though a lot of these compressors are very similar in the way that they're set. So I'll just go ahead and open up these devices here so you can see what's going on. And then I'll just audition them all back to back. So all these compressors sound quite nice, but for the song that we're working on, I think the Puig Child is going to sound the best. That is this vintage tube compressor. So one, it kind of fits with the sort of vintage tone that I like to have on a lot of my mixes, especially on my drums. But it also gives us a lot more of this open and balanced sound that's not super aggressive and in your face, like what you get with this compressor, or kind of the punch and smack that you get in the low end from the SSL model compressor. So in context, the whole mix down, this more open compression is going to fit with the tone of everything. So compressors like this SSL and this specific mix down, a little bit too punchy and has a bit too much low end, and the Fairchild is a bit more open and balanced sounding, which fits the overall tone of this mix a little bit better. So if you have multiple different compressor plugins, I recommend giving this technique a try on your next mix and seeing which type of compressor works best for the element that you're working on. I do this a lot on vocals too. I'll try out a couple of different compressors to see which one best fits the mix and best fits the style of that vocal. Because each of these different compressor devices has their own tone and style, which will cater to various different types of elements in your songs. So the two takeaways from this video is be more intentional with your effects changes and your effects devices that you place onto your tracks. Make sure that you're not cutting and boosting any frequencies or doubling up on compressors where you don't need to. And then when you do select an effects device to place on your channel, go ahead and try out a few different types of effects devices on your signal chains to see which one fits best for that element that you're working on.